I would like to thank the Architecture Foundation for inviting me to discuss the architecture of Henry Kulka. I've made a book on his work in collaboration with New Zealand photographer Mary Gowden. This talk presents Kulka's background and work through a mixture of archival photography and new colour photos which appear in our book. I grew up in New Zealand and studied architecture at Auckland University. One of the school's key intellectual forces was Ross Jenner. Ross is a scholar on the work of architect Adolf Loos, the Moravian architect born in 1870, who died in 1933. This is Ross's house in Auckland, Meadowbank, from 1986. It has some formal similarities with Viennese architect Hermann Czech's houses of the early 1980s. Specifically, it resembles some aspects of Czech's S house of 1983, with its repeating chimney stacks and small windows. So in the 1980s, not only in Vienna, but also in New Zealand, Adolf Loos enjoyed something of a second life. Ross lectured heavily on the work of Adolf Loos. Interest in Loos amongst my peers intensified after publication of two texts in the 1990s by Beatrix Colomina, Sexuality in Space in 1993 and Privacy and Publicity in 1995. Colomina interpreted Loos and also Le Corbusier through the writing and photography which spread their message, which was an idea fit for students studying works of architecture 12,000 miles away via their media afterlife. However, despite the school's strong focus on Loos during my studies, I cannot recall any mention ever of Henry Kulka, arguably Adolf Loos's most significant protege, who emigrated to New Zealand in 1940 and worked there until his death in 1971. At Auckland, we probably learned more about post-structuralism than local building culture. I first came across Henry Kulka browsing the 1991 edition brought out in April of the Italian journal Domus. It featured Kulka's Villa Cantor in Jablanek, Czechia, which dates from 1934. The article was written by Czech historian and architect Jan Sapek. Sapek wrote that the most important worker and the most autonomous spirit amongst the followers of Adolf Loos was unquestionably Heinrich Kulka. Kulka was considered to be practically on the same level as Loos. In a few designs, he actually signed as co-author. Kulka's work was published in Domus alongside buildings by Taddeo Ando, Vittorio Grigotti, and Richard Meyer, and subject to the same level of critique and coverage. And it struck me as extraordinary then that an architect of such international significance, building with fine veneers and marble, producing work of such up-to-the-minute modernity and so obviously indebted to Loos, had ended up in New Zealand. This is Villa Cantor. And it's surrounded by buildings that Sapek described as sort of Saxon classicism, somewhat disparagingly perhaps, which does the town somewhat of a disservice because it has a small but excellent concentration of modern architecture, including two buildings by Heinrich Lauterbach, as well as a wonderful town hall and cinema complex by Carol Winter. The house is in possession of the state, who aspire to restore it and return it to a cultural building. The original vertical circulation was destroyed when the building was turned into flats during the communist era. However, the main living room is remarkably intact, and some of the upper bedroom levels are also. The second key personal discovery as a young architect was Henry Kulka's family house in St Heliers, Auckland, the suburb I grew up in. It dates from 1944. I knocked on the door after reading the Domus article. There is nothing particularly exotic or advanced about either the building's materials or its construction. It was built to a limited budget, constrained by post-war material shortages. It adopts standard New Zealand light timber framing, derived from American balloon framing. Externally, it is moderately modern, and not unlike the work of Auckland architect Vernon Brown, who worked in what Lewis Mumford would later describe as the Bay regional style of Californian William Worcester, amongst others. The soffit is characteristic of Loos, who typically seeks to hide any implication of a pitched roof or guttering. The way that it is done here, however, with a razor-sharp edge, is new. It finds local precedent in the Auckland work of Roy Lippincott, who studied under Frank Lloyd Wright. Lippincott had built an earlier house in Remuera for Kulka's employer, Sir James Fletcher. Internally, it is clad in plywood, which was reasonably available in New Zealand. This photo is by Marty Friedlander, a very well-known New Zealand photographer and friend of Henry Kulka. These photos, however, were taken by architectural writer Peter Shaw, who I discovered had accumulated a wealth of material on Kulka, barely published, and who has helped me greatly with research in our book. The way its spaces are put together is completely different to the work of any other New Zealand architect that I can think of. The sense of interiority, the tightly controlled orchestration of one's journey through small spaces, the envelopment by richly figured walls, the strangely affecting height and scale of things, where the architect places you to sit and look out. Even the specific way of detailing joinery finds no real precedent in New Zealand. For instance, flush panelling is never quite flush. There is always a small 2 to 3 millimeter step between, say, a skirting and a panel, or between a panel and an architrave. I now understand, as I didn't then, that this philosophy of construction can be traced directly back to Adolf Loos. The stair is similar to one in Loos's shoe house, Vienna of 1912. There is also a certain quiet wit to the work. Kulka's clothesline is a mini-essay in classicism. Marc-Antoine Logier's primitive hut is reborn in the suburbs of Auckland to provide a structure for hanging laundry, a literal interpretation of Gottfried Semper's archetypal frame from which to hang textiles. It's that memory of Kulka's house, together with that initial awareness of his European work, which ultimately, years later, led me to embark on this book. This is Kulka in later life, around the sort of mid-1960s, also taken by Marty Friedlander and very kindly lent to us by Leonard Bell. Kulka was born Jindrich in 1900 in Moravia, eastern Czechia. He later changed his name to the more Germanic-sounding Heinrich. Later again, upon arrival in New Zealand, he would change it to the anglicised Henry. In 1919, he became a student of Adolf Loos's Bauschool, his self-initiated alternative to Vienna's architecture school system. From 1920 until 1923, Kulka was a student trainee in Loos's office, working on the Heuberg seedling housing estate in Vienna. Kulka also worked on the Chicago Tribune Tower International Architectural Competition, a colossal Doric column which the jury did not award a prize to. This column building is rather interestingly overlooked by Robert Venturi in his book of 1966, Complexity and Contradiction, and it is worth saying something at this point on Loos's changing critical fortunes because they directly affected Kulka's as well. One might have expected Venturi to see this tower as a pop cultural forebear in the spirit of the inflated sculptures of Klaus Oldenburg and Cozy van Bruggen. However, Venturi actually has nothing to say on Loos at all, which is curious given his desire to reappraise architects who embrace classical architecture, most decisively Sir Edwin Lutyens, who was horribly out of fashion prior to Venturi's intervention. Loos was, for decades, bypassed by American critics, not only by Venturi, but also Venturi's teacher, Vincent Scully, and later another of Scully's students, Spyro Kostoff, author of the tome on modern architecture that was our textbook at Auckland University. For these critics, Loos was considered little more than a proto-modernist, an early designer of white cubic houses, the arch criminal of modernism, as a lecturer in art history once told my class. That view was dominant from the mid-19th until the late 1970s. It is English critic Charles Jenks in his book Postmodern Architecture of 1977, who viewed this tower as a forerunner of postmodernism, with its interest in symbolism, classicism, and as he saw it, humour and irony, although there is really nothing to suggest Loos himself saw his proposal as anything other than serious. But back to Kulka's timeline. In 1921, Kulka aided Loos in the editing and compilation of Loos's writings, later translated into English as Spoken into the Void. In 1922, Kulka worked under Loos on the Villa Rofa in Heitzing, often considered Loos's breakthrough project in terms of organizing spaces according to round plan principles. That is, a three-dimensional assembly of volumes with rooms of differing heights depending on their importance and intended atmosphere, all locked together within one simple outer cube. Kulka is credited with the first use of the term round plan. It is not one which Loos himself ever used. In 1924, when Loos moved to Paris, Kulka continued as a technical manager for Loos in Vienna. Kulka's wife, Hilda Baron, became the practice manager for Loos's office and later Kulka's as well. In 1927, Kulka also moved to Paris following Loos. Here he supervised the alterations to the Ne Jacquet menswear store on the Champs-Elysees and assisted on the unrealized house for dancer Josephine Baker. Kulka assisted Loos's employee Jacques Groeg on Loos's Villa Moller in Vienna. And in 1928, Kulka and Loos returned to Vienna. Together they ran the studio until 1932, when Loos could no longer continue in practice due to ill health. By the early 1930s, Kulka had assumed a senior position, considered by some critics almost Loos's co-worker rather than employee. Kulka was co-architect with Loos on the Werk von Siedling houses in Heitzing, Vienna, and also the Landhaus Kuhne in Peyerbeck from 1930. This is the Landhaus Kuhne at the base of the Semmering Pass at the eastern tip of the Austrian Alps. It's about an hour and a bit by train southwest of Vienna. It was designed as a holiday home for Paul Kuhne, a manufacturer of an early form of margarine called Kuhnerol, who died not long after it was built. After the war, it was bought by the Steiner family, and it has been run for 3 generations now as a hotel and restaurant called the Loos House, spelled H-A-U-S. I'd highly recommend a stay there. It's also pretty affordable. External alterations are fairly minimal, and the building is in very good condition. The living room has been transformed into a restaurant dining area. A few bedrooms are completely original, other than for the introduction of small showers. In many ways, this is a unique work in Loos's over. Also Kulka's. It's the only built work where there is such a strong interest in expressed structure. Here stacked spruce logs interlocked at the corners in the Alpine tradition. Excluding this work, Loos showed no interest in visible structure or honest construction in the sense it was used by modern architects of the 1930s and after. For Loos, as indeed for Kulka, concrete or brick were mere substrates onto which to fix linings and claddings, and it was the emotional charge of these linings which was the focus of his architecture. These photos from Villa Müller, which Kulka didn't work on, but show the sort of the after and the before. As well as being highly regarded by Loos professionally, Kulka and Loos were close personally. Kulka was best man at Adolf Loos's wedding in 1929 to Claire Beck, Loos's third wife, in a photo we were kindly given permission to use by Claire's relatives. Claire stands in the middle, Loos to the right is pulling a face. Kulka is behind, looking extremely youthful. Claire's apparently disapproving mother stands to the right. Claire's father, previously a client of Loos, refused to attend, viewing the marriage as inappropriate due to the considerable age gap between the two. The photo, by the way, is thought to be the work of society photographer Trude Fleischmann, though this has not yet been confirmed. Claire later wrote an account of her marriage to Loos after his death to help raise funds for his tombstone. She died at the hand of the Nazis in 1942. And here it's important to note that a large number of Loos's clients were Jewish. Many died in the war and had their houses possessed, first by the Nazis and later by the communists, so it is a miracle that so many have survived. Kulka wrote the first monograph on Loos, published in 1931 under Loos's direction. For the whole of his career, Loos had shunned photography of his work, saying it would never capture a true impression of his interiors. Loos only altered his view on photography. In fact, he did a complete volte-face right towards the end of his life when he was ill and looking to cement his legacy. Loos and Kulka commissioned Martin Gerlach Jr. to revisit and document Loos's work.
The book was the only publication on Loos until Munz and Kunstler's book of 1964, which was reproduced in English in 1966 with an introduction by Nicholas Pevsner. Though Kulka's book itself has never been translated into English for reasons I am unsure of, today it still remains a key reference point in the study of Loos due to its stunning and precisely composed photography. Beatrix Colomina built much of her critical analysis of Loos in the 1990s from a close reading of these photos. Martin Gerlach Jr.'s work is held in the collections of both the Albertina and Vienna museums. His photos remain one of the few sources available to scholars on Kulka, some of whose own work Gerlach also photographed. Both museums have been very generous in allowing us permission to reproduce works from their archives in our book. After Loos's death in 1933, Kulka continued to practice with an office in Vienna and a second one in Hradec Králové. Under his own name, he completed a number of works, including this building, the Villa Weissmann, the Villa Cantor in Jablonec, which I mentioned before, the stunning Parker pen shop in Vienna, another store for Nijinsky in Prague, the Lohenbach apartment building in Hradec Králové from 1938, and Villa Holzner in Hronov, also from 1938. But as a Jewish architect, following the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in 1938, Kulka was forced to give up the life, contacts, and reputation he had built up over the preceding decades and escape the coming wave of systematic murder. First, the family fled to England, and then with letters of introduction from Arnold Schoenberg, amongst other cultural figures, they travelled to New Zealand in March 1940. Here he built a number of fine timber houses during the 1940s and again towards the end of his career in the 1960s, many for fellow Jewish emigres who recognised his talents. From 1940 until 1960, Henry Kulka worked at Fletcher Construction, New Zealand's major building company, as an architect, rising to the position of their chief architect. This is Fletcher House in Penrose, Auckland. He not only designed buildings across the country for Fletcher, he also designed several significant houses and wide-ranging alterations for the Fletcher family. This is the interior of Fletcher House. This is linseed oil, a division of Fletcher's in Dunedin, south of the South Island from 1943. This is Kid Garrett in central Auckland from 1955. Northern Roller Mills in Tauranga, sort of middle of the North Island from 1955. Same building from ground level. CLI Innes building in Hamilton from 1956. This is the arrival of Queen Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh at Alton Lodge Stud Farm in the Waikato from 1953, which was for one of the Fletcher family. This is them also arriving. By some accounts, Kulka designed around 40 private houses in New Zealand, over 100 commercial buildings, including head offices, factories, and churches. He died in 1971 and is buried in West Auckland in the Jewish section of Waikamete Cemetery. In the past 2 decades, Kulka's name has occasionally entered into the discussion in New Zealand architecture, especially when his houses go up for sale and the real estate agent is actually aware of the building's architect. Frequently, this is not the case. It's not uncommon to hear him mentioned as a forerunner of New Zealand modernism. Certainly it is true that the country's modernism owes a major debt to its emigres, often Jewish and Central European, displaced by the war. It would also be true to state that Kulka's reputation and international status is only equalled by one other emigre to New Zealand, Ernst Plischke, who at one time had been Joseph Frank's assistant. However, today, Plischke is by far the better known of the 2 architects in New Zealand. Today, Kulka's public reputation in New Zealand largely rests on one building, which survives in remarkable condition, the Halberstam House in Karori, Wellington from 1948. There are some key reasons why Kulka is not better known today. I've touched on one, namely that Loos's own name lost currency, or rather the complexity of his thought was completely overlooked. From around the time of his death, so that's 1933, until the 1980s. Loos's wilderness years coincided with Kulka's period in New Zealand,
and then extended for some time after as well. Secondly, until the 1990s, publishing on New Zealand architecture in New Zealand, other than the occasional survey or coffee table book, was vanishingly rare. It really took New Zealand writer Peter Shaw to redirect the focus back onto a huge number of architects, many of them emigres, who had previously been placed in the margins, and this included Kulka. A further key reason is that reproduction of material from Kulka's archive, both drawings and writing, photographs of his work, and correspondence with Loos, is under the control of his ancestors since Kulka's death and largely remains private. Kulka's photography of his buildings, his writings, his drawings are all considered copyright of the estate and cannot be reproduced. A book by the estate has been spoken of as being in production since Kulka's death in 1971. However, to date, no book nor articles have emerged. The lack of sustained scholarship on Kulka has sadly contributed to the destruction of his work. In Auckland's superheated speculative housing market, where land is more valuable than the building it accommodates, and heritage protections are at best minimal, and most notably extremely weak for modern architecture, there has been the ongoing loss of Kulka's work, both domestic and commercial, right up to the present day. Some were destroyed even in the space of making this book. I'm aware of at least 2 houses in Auckland which look set to be demolished in the coming months. This destruction appears to have been almost completely unobserved. The irony today is that Kulka's reputation in New Zealand is better now than it has ever been, while there is ever less to see. In contrast to this, in Europe, over the past 10 years, interest in Kulka's work has grown, backed in cases by considerable state-level funding. The centre of this interest is Pilsen in southwestern Czechia. Pilsen is an industrial city known for the vast Soviet-era Skoda Works factory, armaments and vehicles, also the home of Pilsner beer. But Pilsen also has the greatest concentration of works by Loos interiors that one can visit anywhere in Europe, more so than Paris, Prague, or Vienna. Adolf Loos built at least 8 interiors in Pilsen from 1908 through to the end of his life. Today, Loos is an important component of Pilsen's tourism. In Chechnya as a whole, there is a strong national interest in modern architecture. The country has an enviable history of saving, restoring, and providing public access to its modern heritage. One thinks of the extraordinary restoration of Mises Villa Tugendhat in Brno from around 2010 to 2012. 4 of Loos's apartments are now in the ownership of the city of Pilsen. 3 of these have been meticulously restored at huge care, effort, and expense: apartments Brummel, Vogel, and Kraus. The 4th is apartment Semler, which is a work by Loos and Kulka. The apartment was designed and built between 1932 and 1934. It was purchased by the city in 2012, and for the next 7 years underwent the slow, painstaking restoration to address fundamental water tightness and structural issues. Parts of the ground floor were slowly restored to allow the public a glimpse at what had remained hidden, though years later, and several alterations. In April 2019, the building was closed to the public to start the major restoration of the exterior, the grounds, the basement, and the upper floors, and the conversion of the non-Loos half of the building into a centre for architectural research. We visited and photographed apartment Semler in the state of partial restoration the day after it had closed to the public and the day before the final restoration work began. The restoration is under the charge of architect and writer Peter Dominicki, who's also written a fine book full of original research describing the connections between Loos and Pilsen. The design started when Loos was already ill, afflicted by numerous ailments, including stomach cancer, deafness, syphilis, and some believe the onset of dementia. Due to this, Loos's involvement was likely restricted to a sketch plan. Heinrich Kulka is now considered as a minimum to be the co-author of the Semler apartment. His technical abilities overseeing Loos's work have long been recognized, but his creative input is now finally becoming better appreciated. It is this creativity emerging from the shadow of Loos that is something Sapek's article was most keen to impress upon Domus's readers. The building reopened to the public in September, that's last month. However, it's also important not to overstate the role of Loos's employees. All of Loos's work relied on partnerships with key
collaborators, such as Karel Loter at Villa Muller and Villa Winternetz, both in Prague, or say Paul Engelmann, a student of Loos's and later architect with Ludwig Wittgenstein on the house of Wittgenstein's sister, or Jacques Roeg, subject of a recent book by Doppelhaus Press, or Kurt Yehuda Unger, amongst several others. Those always attracted considerable talent. One also thinks of his students, Richard Neutra, Rudolf Schindler, or Margaret Schutter-Lehetsky, an employee and later designer of the Frankfurt kitchen. Many of these collaborators saw themselves as Loos's faithful disciples in the sense of spreading his word and ensuring his legacy. Highly capable architects who could carry forward Loos's minimal instructions assuredly and creatively in between extended periods when Loos would visit the site. The evident care with which Loos chose his collaborators is apparent in the remarkably consistent and high caliber design and execution seen through his body of work. The book which Mary Gowden and I have made arose from wanting to improve awareness of Kulka, particularly in New Zealand. This is Penrose House for the Fletcher family from 1943, which is the conversion of a colonial villa. So little of his work is known about other than via black and white photography that is now at least 60 years old. The photography of Kulka's European work is 90 years old. Mary and I started in 2019 with our visit to Apartment Semler and completed it this year with a visit to New Zealand after a long disruption in the middle due to the impossibility of travel due to COVID, especially as New Zealand shut its borders to all overseas travellers for a period of about 2 years. We have obtained archival material held in national institutions and libraries, as well as from the company Kulka worked at for 20 years in New Zealand, Fletcher Construction, who together with the Warren Trust, which is a benevolent trust put together by Sir Miles Warren, have provided funding for this book and helped make it a reality. We wanted to show the buildings as they are. This is the Sharp House in Titirangi from 1965. And by as they are, I mean aged, weathered, with patina, lived in, and in some cases prior to restoration or midway through. The emphasis of the photography is on colour and also on the things that you touch, joinery, which opens up to reveal hidden surprises, or freestanding furniture Kulka design, comfortable chairs, door handles, fittings, lights and windows. Visiting these works, you can see how the same creative mind, working across different continents, subtly changed when encountering the differing building cultures and climates of Europe and New Zealand. The book is a close look at 3 buildings in Europe: Landhaus Kuna, Apartment Semler and Villa Canto, and 3 in New Zealand: Penrose House, the Halberstam House and the Sharp House. It's 400 pages long with around 250 images. An essay accompanies each building. The idea is to allow an intimate, slow-paced reading of each building and to move the reader through the building to discover the varying atmospheres of its interiors. We hope that the book helps contribute to the rediscovery of Henry Kulka, an architect who over a 50-year career quietly and consistently produced such ravishing work. Thank you.